Hello. Give a couple more minutes here. All right. Hey, everyone. I think we can probably get started. Paul is away this week, so I'm hosting. All right, so it looks like we have a pretty light agenda today, so maybe this will be shorter. I wanted to give everyone an update on kind of the MCS implementation, how that's going now that it's gotten started. Some of you may have seen, I shared out last night a link to a doc that came out of conversations with SIG Network about how we want to integrate the multi-cluster services APIs with kubeproxy, and what might be the best way to go about this. And so I'll share my screen here. All right. So basically, when I originally planned to go about this, I think we had talked with SIG Network a while ago about basically having kubeproxy just ingest the CRDs directly, just like it does with service, and go about the implementation that way, making this simpler probably from our perspective, but certainly have more impact on kubeproxy, but with the idea that overall performance would be better this way. So when filing the ticket to create a staging repo that kubeproxy could actually use to import the resources, Andrew, who is here today, suggested that instead we maybe look at just using service instead. And the idea would basically be that we have another controller, or maybe the implementation could be responsible for this directly, but this controller creates a proxy service for the original service import, so that kubeproxy can ingest that service just like any other service today. And so basically the controller would be responsible for configuring endpoint slices to reference that new service as well as the service import, and then the service import would still be used for DNS, and then we would also, at least unless we fix this, we would have alternative like cluster local overloaded DNS records for that original service. But this is a way to kind of implement the Multicluster Services API without any changes to kubeproxy itself. Then another idea that was brought up was the idea of introducing a proxy sidecar, basically in kubeproxy, that proxies API requests so that we can inject services in flight. I think some of the feedback was that this approach kind of had some of the drawbacks of both. So maybe, I don't know that this is necessarily the way to go. And then the last idea, of course, was to go ahead with using a staging repo, which is more invasive, requires a new staging repo and a lot of process overhead there. But in terms of implementation, might be a little simpler. So that's kind of the conversation. I think it'd be good to get more feedback. Or Andrew, since you're here, if you want to kind of chime in on what you're thinking.
Yeah, sure. I think the more I think about it, the more unsure I am with my original suggestion. Like after reading the stuff a few times, I'm not sure anymore. But I think one clarifying question is, like, for the last point, for if we go with the staging repo, is that a staging repo, but the APIs are still CRDs, or is it staging repo as core APIs?
Yeah, staging repo, but still CRDs. I think we kind of all see MCS as a like a valuable, hopefully common add-on, but certainly optional. You'd still probably start with single cluster Kubernetes.
Okay, I think like one thing that was interesting that you mentioned in the last SIG network call was that you said that the thing that manages the data plane, so like kubeproxy in this case, is a thing that should consume the service import directly. So like following that model, I think just staging the multi-cluster API and having kubeproxy consume service import makes sense. But like I'm thinking, like, if the cluster was running a service mesh instead, is the expectation that like if let's say the service mesh proxy was like Envoy, are we expecting like Envoy to watch service imports directly? Like that seems pretty far-fetched, and I don't think Envoy would ever do that. So like in a service mesh world, I would assume that like there's a controller that creates service import, and then another controller consumes it and then talks to Envoy using XDS or whatever.
Exactly. That's kind of what I think. So I think my expectation is something like this. Like if we take Istio as an example, like Istio pilot would consume the service import that whatever implementation that you were using with kubeproxy creates, and then it would feed that to Envoy over XDS. So your Envoy controller would be responsible for translating the service import.
Okay. Yeah, I think both seem pretty reasonable solutions to me. Like I think the only reason that I'd still prefer like using actual services is just because, like, purely for the reason that we get to start out of tree, and if it works out of tree, then we don't have to worry about going in tree, as opposed to starting in tree and then trying to go out of tree. But aside from that, like I don't think I have really strong opinions at this point.
Okay, that's good to know. So all right, so that seems a reasonable motivator. Does anyone else here have any other thoughts on this? Or I think I linked this in the notes in the agenda, so if you want to chime in offline,
so
that would be great as well.
Hey Jeremy.
Oh, hey Tim.
Andrew, I really appreciate your comments here. As one of the other people who's on the hook for maintaining kubeproxy, I definitely see both sides of this coin. And I find what you're saying, Andrew, actually to be fairly compelling. I'm just concerned about the amount of debris that comes out of this, like all the little services that we end up sprinkling around that we have to manage by names to, like, it feels dirty. I love it from a getting stuff to prove that it works point of view, I don't know if it's what I'd want to go with when we're really happy with it. Does that make sense? Like once we know what the API is, once we really have confidence in it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I'm thinking like the reverse, where if we ended up not liking the API, right, then we're stuck, kind of like, you know, adding a bunch of stuff to kproxy. But I guess like that's why we're kind of starting it at alpha and promoting it as we go. So
right. We shouldn't rush to that ultimate conclusion, but it does seem to be like a reasonable ultimate conclusion. Like Jeremy gave me a peek at the code he was writing to do the integration. It's really not that bad, right? Like internally it translates to the same structure. It's not so awful. Would I want to do 10 of these? No, I probably wouldn't.
Right. And for anyone else who's interested too, this doc links a PR that is definitely not ready to be merged, but works. And I linked in the agenda a demo that you can use to kind of pull it down and play with it too. But yeah, I agree. We would not want to do this 10 times. It'd be very gross.
Okay, so
I think the good news. Sorry, say the good news is that hopefully Gateway obviates the need to do this 10 times.
Right.
Okay, yeah, because my next question was like, what sets the precedent for like the next time, right? Like we don't want to do it 10 times, but we want to do it like 2 more times, 3 more times. So yeah, if we're saying like Gateway is going to solve it for the 80-90% use case, that sounds good to me.
Yeah. My kind of hope is that we have service, which is your kind of cluster local endpoint aggregator, and then you have service import, which is your multi-cluster endpoint aggregator. And then hopefully, those are primitives that you can build on, and maybe Gateway we want to import in a way as well, because that's the new, more generic way to describe things. But if we look at it as the service is the one-to-one, and service import is the one-to-many, maybe there isn't really another level there. So it would be more of like the Gateway replacing some functionality that comes in and is the next case versus another generalization.
So what's the reason for like us wanting to put service import like in tree with kproxy but not Gateway?
Practicality, I think, is really it. I don't think we actually want service import in tree. I think it's just that today, well, I mean, and staging is kind of the half in, half out, right? And I think it's really just that, we want it out of tree, but in practice for a core component to consume it, it should at least be in staging. Or it's just vendored, but that, gets really confusing because now you have to tie API reversions back to Kubernetes releases in a much more convoluted way.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Where are we, Jeremy, with timelines? Like, at what point does this hard decision need to come down?
I mean, I would certainly like as soon as possible. If in the next week it could be decided, that would be excellent. I think it would be just great if we could hit alpha in 120. So unblocking this so we can start merging things, especially because there is a fair amount of process if we go the staging repo route. It's not so much effort, but there's a few issues that need to get resolved. I think sooner is better.
I mean, if I was the only person that was like opposed to the staging idea, yeah, I think I'm convinced. So,
yeah, well, now you got me thinking. Jeremy, are there? We don't need to take up the whole day on this, but one last question, I guess. We had talked at some point about security import being safe because normal users couldn't write to it. If we change that so that it ends up creating a service, and the service is the thing that actually triggers the multi-cluster IP to be captured, does that present any security or permissions problems?
Yes. Now, yeah, the model gets a lot more convoluted because you wouldn't be able to touch a service import, but you'd be able to touch a service. You know, I
So
suppose
everybody could take a service and decorate it and saying, I belong to service import foo.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends how we did the name mapping. And you know, if the service import, if the service import has a reference to its service, or instead of the service referencing the service import. I don't actually think with this model, like the service needs to know what service import it came from. So, you know, obviously that makes it easier for debugging for users, but I think, you know, like that could be an annotation that is just there for the user. I think it's more
would this new sort of phony service be used for DNS also, or would DNS understand service import directly?
I think multi-cluster service DNS would still talk to service import directly. Of course, traditional DNS, regular cluster DNS would understand the phony service. But yeah, I don't think we would. It doesn't make sense to do something special with DNS for the phony service. I think service import still makes sense there.
Okay, that was my biggest concern, I think, was around the DNS side.
Yeah. But it does mean that, like, we will have extra DNS records, of course, for the dummy service.
Yeah, it's not the end of the world, but yeah.
Right.
Okay,
yeah,
we should probably.
I see. Yeah, I think maybe. I don't know if we need to eat the whole day on this, but I see like the Core DNS plugin for a multi-cluster service, for example, as a separate add-on a separate plugin that you turn on versus, you know, something that we necessarily want to work in to the core Kubernetes plugin, at least at first.
Yeah, I mean, this is partially complicated by the fact that kubeproxy is still considered to be part of the core when really it shouldn't be, right?
Right.
Like, there's no reason kubeproxy in its entirety shouldn't be in a staging repo of its own.
Right, and if that were the case, then multi-cluster services would probably be in SIGs, or at least its own repo.
Makes me wonder if we should just support staging like Kubernetes 6 repos.
Sorry, if we should support it or abort it?
Support being able to stage a repo in Kubernetes 6. Because if it wasn't for staging, like, we'd put the multi-cluster APIs in 6.kits.io, right? But it's going in kits.io because we need to stage it.
Jeremy, can you say again? Sorry, we are going to end up wasting the whole day on this. Can you say again why vendoring it is a problem? Like, why not put it somewhere else and then vendor it back in?
Versioning, I think, is the biggest thing. Well, first of all, I don't see any precedent for that. So I don't know that we want to be the first to say, hey, we're just going to vendor some SIGs repo. So that's one, because that just hasn't happened, as far as I can tell. The other thing is version.
Eventually it's going to have to happen with something like Gateway, right? Because at some point, kubeproxy is going to have to implement some portions of Gateway for L4 services. So we're going to have to cross that bridge eventually.
Well, or we decide that at least part of Gateway or all of Gateway actually can't live in SIGs and needs to be moved in, right? So I think maybe that's the answer, and certainly that's kind of more in your domain to drive, but I don't think that decision has actually been made, right?
Sure. But we will have to make, like, you're not alone in having to make this decision.
Right. And so part of it, honestly, is as kind of trailblazing with this, as also the first attempt, or at least the first potentially successful attempt to use CRDs in tree, or for more core components. You know, I think part of it, honestly, is trying to pick the challenges. But I think the biggest issue I see with vendoring is versioning. Like, which version of Kubernetes supports which version of the multi-cluster services API, since kubeproxy is kind of tied in with everything, at least in practice, is really easy in the staging repo, right? It becomes a lot more difficult to track down, and you have to rely a lot more on documentation if you're vendoring.
So even if we'd moved, never mind, I answered my own question in my head. I'll shut up.
All right.
All right, so we need to tackle this. We don't need to tackle it all here. I flagged your doc for reading and pontification some more. And I will have to, maybe I'll come up with some more questions around timelines and sequencing. Like, how bad would it be if we started with X and moved to Y or something? But I don't really know what those questions are yet. So
I do think potentially starting with SIGs and this service approach with a plan, like to migrate to staging, or at least make a final decision before beta, wouldn't be the worst thing. You know, that is a route as well. Like, I agree that starting in staging is probably more of a commitment. I mean, we're starting with alpha too, so we reserve the right to pull it out. But I agree, moving from SIGs to staging is probably easier than moving from staging to SIGs. But I think, you know, there is a lot more clutter with the other approach, and I think there's some things we didn't count on, like how do I actually track that my service was properly created by this new intermediate controller, which starts complicating things too. So, you know, I want to make sure that if we're testing alpha as a way to get experience with the API, but we make the API a lot more difficult to use, so we don't get that experience, you know, are we hurting ourselves?
have you thought through that fully? Is that is that part of the doc that I haven't read yet?
The drawbacks there with, yeah, I think, I mean, I tried to keep it relatively light, so, you know, it's not a novel, but yeah, the drawbacks of the approaches are listed. I think only in the comments is the moving in tree out of tree discussed, but I'll move that in.
All right, I'll try to read this doc ASAP.
Okay, cool. All right, I believe that is all we actually had on the agenda today. So unless anyone wants to add anything else, maybe we can get some time back. All right. Well, I guess before we go, per last week's discussion on cluster registry, Paul shared out on the mailing list a doc where we can start kind of enumerating various potential use cases for a registry. So, you know, anyone's interested, please take a look, add your ideas. I think it'd be good to get that discussion going. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
See you next week.
Thanks, all.